Greetings great guys, welcome back to What If Goku Was an Avatar. This is part 3, but before we continue, I'll just give you a quick recap from part 2. Right, so Gran had just announced that Toku may have been the Avatar. Toku, the next day, had together with his father and some of the elders in the village, tried to see what more he could do, element-wise. But as much as they tried, it didn't seem like Toku could waterbend, or bend any other elements for that matter. They then left it at that for the time being, as not long after that, the men had to go off to war. Later on, the three siblings went on a fishing trip, where Toku ended up accidentally breaking, the boat, which led to them discovering the iceberg. This in turn led to them meeting Aang. There was a goofy interaction between them all, and Aang offered to give them all a ride back to the village on Appa. There we go, all caught up. Let's move on with the story, shall we? As the four of them were cruising on Appa through the icy water, somewhere not super duper far away, Prince Zuko was jumping up and down. Well, not quite jumping, but you get the idea. He was filled with hope again. "Helmsman, set a course for the light!" And just like that, Iroh did not get to finish his game. Back at the village, the four of them arrived and then awoke the next morning, because apparently it took them all night to get back, at least in the original, judging by the fact that Aang fell asleep and awoke the next day. Toku, Katara and Sokka introduced Aang to the village, and the village to Aang. I'm not saying Sokka here was completely okay with the fact that there was a newcomer. He had still made that promise to their dad to keep the village safe, but at least he didn't banish him this time. The four of them then continued their day and left Gran to her thinking. "I believe that boy, the Airbender, may be the Avatar," she thought to herself. But also knew that she had had that same thought about Toku in the past, so she wasn't as sure about it this time. Sokka, being the oldest of the four, decided to leave the group for a while to do his man of the village chores. But we still need someone to show Aang around, don't we? So Katara together with Toku did just that. This of course led to them discovering the old Fire Nation ship. Well, I say discovering, Katara and Toku already knew about it, and Toku had actually already been inside when no one was looking, at least a little bit. Aang, together with Toku, then convinced Katara to go inside, as letting go of one's fears is how you grow as a bender. The trio had their look around, also running into a booby trap or two, though this time Toku was to blame for that mess up. This of course alerted Zuko, who saw them jumping down from the ship to the ground through his monocular telescope. He had done it. He had found the Avatar, as well as his hiding. Once the three of them got back to the village, Sokka was there to meet them, as well as the village. Sure, Sokka was more lenient in this what if, but even so, he and Gran both had a thing or two to say about that stunt. They calmed down slightly once Toku explained that he was to blame and not Aang, so once again, Aang was not at risk of getting tossed out. But all three of them still got a good scolding for having gone on board that forbidden ship that Katara and Toku knew oh so well not to get on. Sokka pointed out that the missile, or firework thing, probably was a signal to the Fire Nation, and that they should all expect the worst. This of course messed with Aang's head again. He did believe that what Toku and Katara had told him inside the ship earlier was true. The war and the 100-year time skip, but as you can imagine, that's not an easy thing to grasp. He had friends in the Fire Nation. Were they really about to attack? Right here? Right now? Aang's internal questions were answered shortly, as they caught sight of a ship far away in the distance, heading their way. Sokka immediately ran out to the tent to put his mascara on, to prepare for battle, and Toku ran after him. While Aang and Katara were still outside, Katara was stressing out a bit, trying to help the others secure the village and calm the children down as best they could, while Aang was kind of run-walking beside her to catch up. Aang, being the peace-loving monk he is, combined with also having friends in the Fire Nation, or so he thought, proposed they simply talk things out. Who knows, maybe they'll listen. This made Katara stop her frantic pacing for just a second and look at Aang. Katara then pulled a classic mother card and explained how the Fire Nation soldiers weren't of the listening sorts. This answer shut Aang up for the time being. By the time Sokka and Toku had gotten ready, well, mostly Sokka, Toku was pretty much dressed the same and didn't generally use spears or axes for fighting. But anyhow, by the time they'd made it up to the top of the village's outer wall, the ship had also made it there. The ship's door, for lack of a better word, then opened, and out came the banished prince himself, together with his men. Sokka knew that his brother was way stronger than he was by now, but that didn't stop him from being the first to attack. he was the big brother. He was the protector of the village. He would prove it. Now, we know how things go down for poor Sokka in the original. Well, here, he didn't get kicked to the side with ease. Instead, he put up a much better, more unpredictable first swing at Zuko that Zuko barely had the time to block. I'm afraid to say though that despite Sokka's improvements, he fell short and almost took a good blow to the head, but was saved the embarrassment and headache by Toku. Toku caught the prince's attack with ease and proceeded to toss him away. Sokka thanked Toku and they smiled, but then quickly turned around realising that they had just thrown the threat closer to the village. Before the soldiers could stop them, they ran down to the others again, blocking off Zuko. Zuko got up with a frown, his men rapidly joining him. Remember, Toku's power level is maybe 20 or 30, which I think is reasonable considering he hasn't had a master just yet. Just kind of more motivation and his siblings to spar with, but that's still a high number compared to most normal people and benders, so throwing Zuko that far wasn't really that difficult. Zuko did not appreciate being tossed 30 metres across the snow though, and was about to get to his firebending, but stopped himself. He would fight if he had to, but judging by that kid's strength or waterbending or whatever the heck that was, maybe a bluff would do him better, because landing from that height, it bloody hurts. Anyway, the bluff being that he was superior and was willing to give them all a chance, and do things the easy way. He explained that he wasn't looking for a fight, but just the Avatar. He didn't walk up and snatch Grand to show what age the Avatar should be though. Nope, not on this one. He didn't want to risk being tossed again and maybe ending up in the water this time, so he kept things fairly civil. Toku, being the bravest one in the village, talked back, stating that there was no Avatar in this tribe and that he and his men should leave, or they'd have to answer to him. He got into a fighting stance as he said this. Zuko then shot some fire through the air, just to show that he meant business, but this did not scare Toku even one bit. Aang, however, didn't want to cause the village any harm, and walked up to them, standing a bit in front of Toku. "I hear you're looking for me! If I go with you, do you promise to leave the village in peace?" Zuko stared in amazement, surprised that the supposed Avatar was just a kid, but then quickly regained his composure, having just been offered the Avatar on a silver platter by the Avatar himself. He then nodded, as the soldiers proceeded to take Aang away, much like they did in the original. This was of course surprising to the rest of them as well. The Avatar? Why hadn't he said anything? Or was he just bluffing to save the village? But they didn't have time to wonder about that now, as they were all overcome with sadness and amazement, seeing this boy sacrifice himself for them. This didn't sit well with Toku though, and he was about to go on the attack, saying that Zuko could just dream on, but Sokka stopped him. "Let go, Sokka! We can take him!" "Maybe, yes, but that's not a fight we want to have here in the village, Toku. Think about the kids." "Ah, come on, there must be something we can do." "Toku's right, Sokka. He just gave himself up. We owe it to him." Sokka, being the older and more strategic sibling, explained that they would help him, but not yet. They would wait for the time to be right, and then follow them. This would ensure the village's safety and surprise the enemy. His younger siblings agreed to the plan, and they all got prepared. Sokka started loading the canoe, but Toku stated that he could carry them both and run. That would be quicker. They pondered the idea for a second, but decided they would need the boat for storage. Gran then showed up, busting their plan, but simply smiled and gave them her love and best wishes, as well as some sleeping bags. As they were about to leave, they heard a loud roar. They quickly turned around, believing it to be a massive Chewbacca, but saw it was Appa. Maybe they could catch up to the ship flying on him. Right, back at the ship. Things went down pretty much the same way as they did in the original, except during Aang's and Zuko's squabble inside the ship, there'd be a little conversation about Toku. Zuko questioned Aang about the powerful waterbender, well, he meant Toku of course, to which Aang would respond that he wasn't. In fact, Toku was a firebender. Now I know it may seem like betrayal, Aang giving away information or telling the truth, or at least what he thought was the truth, but Aang here thought that by doing so, he would accomplish two things. 1. Show Zuko that there were good firebenders out there, and 2. Ensure that Zuko did not go back to the village again in the future. What if he had found out that Toku was a firebender later on, and kept believing he was a waterbender? He might have gone back there to catch him, thinking he was the Avatar. No, the truth was better. Zuko, of course, did not buy all of that, and even if it were true, it didn't change anything. This was something he had to do. He went on to talk about restoring his honour and getting his father's acceptance, and that this wasn't something Aang, being a monk, would understand. He had his tickets and he was going home. Finally. Or so he thought. He got a little distracted by his own thoughts for a second, and Aang seized the opportunity and used his airbending to slam that funky old mattress against the prince, swatting him up to the ceiling, almost knocking him out. We then get that scene where Aang almost escapes, but Zuko from out of nowhere jumps out behind and pulls him down because actually I have no idea how he did that in the original, but yeah. The fight continues down on deck. Aang gets knocked off board, goes into the Avatar state, and then proceeds to best Zuko's team effortlessly. This stunned all three of the siblings, who had just about caught up with the ship by now. They flew down and proceeded to help Aang up, who had just fallen over due to the momentary Avatar state exhaustion he always seems to get when he was new to it at least. Toku here didn't wait for Aang to get to his feet though, before questioning him in amazement. But before Aang had a chance to respond that he didn't know how he did it, more soldiers arrived. Zuko had almost made it on board again, but we all know how Sokka took care of him. Ah, I love that glider, face-poking move. Katara then went on to free some of the soldiers, and without having to turn around to do so, while Toku kicked some of them off of the deck, landing on poor Zuko. The gang then took off, but just moments after, Zuko and Iroh shot that large fireball towards them. Oh, and just a side note, I still don't think to this day that Iroh put his all into that blast. Anyway, Sokka and Katara started to freak out, but Aang, together with Toku, took care of the incoming attack. Toku's fire beam, thanks to Aang's air blast, made for a very large explosion-like attack. This of course meant that Zuko's ship got even more damaged than in the original, meaning it would take a longer time to get it out of there and also a longer time to get repaired. Zuko couldn't believe his eyes. Had that kid just firebended? Sure, the bold boy had told him he could, but did this mean that the water boy was the Avatar? In that case, was the monk just a normal airbender? This wasn't possible, they'd all been wiped out. This left the prince with an even bigger headache than he already had. Iroh, at this point, was still kind of groggy from his nap and was like, "At least we know that the Fire Nation's greatest threat is just a boy. Uncle, that boy did all this. Also, there's something not right about them. Which one of them's the Avatar?" Now, Iroh couldn't be completely sure having seen the attack from so far away, but that did not look like firebending to him. It may fool most other people, but remember, Iroh is one of the best firebenders in the whole series, and also kind of old, so he's seen plenty of stuff. "Interesting," he muttered to himself, as he scratched his beard. But he kept that thought to himself. "Waterchai plus Aang, 1. Fire Nation, 0. Sokka cried out as Toku cheered with him. He had been longing for a fight. Mind you, it was a very easy fight for the 12-year-old, but it felt good having gotten some real action for once. Katara then turned towards Aang and asked why he didn't tell them he was the Avatar. The brothers turned to look at him as well. Aang then told them that he never wanted to be. "But Aang, the world's been waiting for the Avatar to return, so the war can come to an end." Aang then told them that he had no idea how to do that, and so the whole conversation about mastering the 4 elements and going to the North Pole took place. Toku also reminded him of how easily they had taken down the last bunch, so with a bit of teamwork, it should be a cinch. Now, just so the story doesn't become like 40 parts long, I will skip some parts here and there and just sometimes mention parts briefly. For example, they still went to the Air Temple, where Aang had to face the hard truth. He was really the only airbender left, and his people were dead. Also, Toku wasn't half bad at airball. Sure, he couldn't play it the exact same way Aang did, because he couldn't airbend, but he sure could throw that ball far. Back to Zuko. He was behind schedule compared to canon, meaning he had only just made it to the harbour to get the damages to his ship repaired by the time the gang had left the Air Temple. Also, the repairs took a bit longer. This may seem meaningless, but this would lead to him not having time to catch up to them on Kyoshi Island. So the gang had a longer and more peaceful time on the island. This combined with the fact that Sokka wasn't as, well, you know, Sokka. That is to say, he was more humble and accepting towards strong females, having grown up with a more powerful Katara, plus a younger brother, stronger than himself. So female warriors, not too weird. This meant that he and Suki hit things off quicker and got more time together. Careful, Princess Yue. Sokka might have already been taken by the time you meet him. Joking. Or am I? The gang didn't end up staying for too long, however, as they had places to be and people to see. Omashu being one of them. As Aang was putting on his disguise and getting into the role as Pippin Paddle Obstacopolis the Third, Katara told Toku not to use his bending. Yes, by the way, they all still assume it's firebending. But the reason Katara said this is, despite him being with them and a water tribe looking person, to firebend in the city would probably scare the civilians, alert the guards, and before they could even say earthbending style, they'd all be chucked in prison. Toku would be seen as a Fire Nation spy, and therefore Sokka and Katara too. being dressed in a similar fashion. Also, calling unwanted attention upon themselves may reveal Aang being the Avatar, which would then spread the news even quicker than they wanted it to. Toku understood, and so the gang headed for the entrance. The four of them were doing quite well inside the walls. That's until they decided to use the post system as a roller coaster. They crashed, blew their covers, and got taken to see King Bumi to receive their sentences. He threw them a feast. Toku did not hesitate and quickly scoffed down half the table, which shocked the guards a bit. But Bumi didn't mind. He was more interested in Aang. Some time went by, and then suddenly he threw a chicken drumstick towards Aang at lightning speed. But there was no need for Aang to airbend to stop it. Toku's mouth got in the way, and he gobbled it up, spat out the bone, and burped. This threw the crazy king off guard. "Bon appetit," said the king with a smirk. "Bad manners, though. I have a bone to pick with you," he said with a poker face and weird music in the background. "Oh, sorry, were you gonna eat that?" No, not me, but the baldy behind. To heck with it. There is an airbender in our presence, and not just any airbender. The Avatar, he exclaimed, and stood up for dramatic effect, even though it didn't go as he had planned. Aang then confessed in a silly way, looking underneath the table to then say there were no firebenders here, and they tried to leave, but were of course stopped and then told about the 3 deadly challenges that awaited the Avatar the next day. Now, I know they could probably have made an escape here, and successfully too, but I don't think they would, as they were very passive in the original. I'm not sure if it's because they were trying to own up to their mistakes, wrecking the town and the post office and simply disrupting the citizens' lives earlier. Or maybe they were simply outclassed and didn't want to try and fight their way out and thought it would be better to escape once they were inside the chamber. Either way, they didn't escape, and I'm keeping it that way in my what if as well. Once inside the chamber, they started talking about escaping. Momo failed to fit through the hole to get Appa though because he had been eating apple. Toku then stood up and made an attempt to take down the wall himself with his fist. It didn't come crumbling down or anything, but it cracked all over. "Yeah, we should be out in no time." The others stopped him though and reminded him that the chamber was newly refurbished and breaking it could lead to an even worse punishment. Aang then stated that the best thing they could do was to stay put and simply do the challenges, even though they did worry him a bit. And that will be all for this part. See you in part 4, if you want one that is. Oh Jesus, Boomy, your voice is painful.